Hi everyone, this is Jung Rajiv from PhD Expertise. Today we'll be talking to our special guest, Emma Pettit. Emma graduated in 2020 with a bachelor degree in chemical engineering at Georgia Tech, where I had the opportunity to work with her on a fuel cell research project. She is currently a PhD student at University of Minnesota in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Material Science. Welcome to the program, Emma.
Thanks for having me.
I'll kick off with the first question. I remember you were a very bright student when I worked with you. What were some of the reasons that you decided to pursue a graduate education?
Yeah, part of it was working with you as an undergrad at Georgia Tech. I thought the research that Dr. Fuller's group and that you were doing was really interesting. And I liked sort of getting to see some of the questions that you guys were asking and trying to answer, and some of the work you did and learning those experimental techniques. But in addition to that, I also had the opportunity to intern a couple of times while I was at Georgia Tech. And a lot of my supervisors at those jobs were chemical engineering PhDs or mechanical engineering PhDs. And again, getting to see sort of the types of techniques they applied, the types of questions they were trying to answer. That really made me think that that was something that I was interested in being involved in. I think sort of I don't want to say more challenging questions, but the sort of more open-ended questions that you get to answer or try to answer as a PhD in industry or in academia or wherever you choose to go with your PhD. I think that was something that I really wanted to do. So I liked the research techniques, and I also really liked the questions that I saw people trying to answer. So I think that was the main motivator for pursuing my PhD.
I see. Speaking of applying for a PhD, I know that GRE is still probably a very important part of the grad school application for many schools. Can you talk about how you prepare for the verbal, quantitative, and writing? Perhaps talk about them separately.
Yeah. So I took the GRE in, I think, mid-September 2019. And I think I started preparing for it in late July 2019. Fortunately, my answer to this question might be a bit basic because, especially for the mathematics and the verbal section, I primarily used the prep books that were available and used the question books that were available. So I was working when I was studying. So I would come home after work and for about half an hour, just do a practice test, work through some questions, read through some of the tips, especially for those two sections. And then for the more essay section of the GRE, I did study for that one a little bit differently because that's sort of a different skill. It's a little bit less answering a multiple choice question. So I read through a bunch of example prompts that they'd given to past students trying to answer that on the GRE, trying to get a sense of what kinds of questions they were likely to ask, what they were looking for, because they did have examples of past student answers that were good, and then some that they were less satisfied with. So trying to get a sense of what the students who did well did, and then what some of the mistakes that I wanted to try to avoid were. And then for that one as well, just because writing an essay in 30 minutes is definitely challenging, and trying to make sure you get your thoughts down. I practiced a handful of times, I would say a number of times, writing 30-minute long essays based on some of the prompts that they had, and just making sure, writing a little tiny outline, figuring out how to get that in within the time, and then going through and writing a full essay based on that. So just timing myself, making sure in 30 minutes I can actually write an essay, and then just practicing based on the questions that seemed likely to be asked.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've seen that there's a lot of material on YouTube, for instance. There's like forums that people post on for GRE kind of questions. How useful did you find any of those types of things?
I can't say that I took advantage of those as much as I maybe should have. I do think I was definitely most concerned about the essay section. So I would say I did take advantage of those a little bit for that. I think that's where I got some of the example questions and some of the ideas of like how you should properly time yourself within these 30 minutes. So I took advantage of that some. For the multiple choice, I really did primarily use the available resources that came with registering for the GRE. But for the quantitative reasoning for the essay, I think, or not quantitative reasoning, excuse me, the essay section, I did take advantage of some of the forums.
You said you were working and you come home for about 30 minutes. I think I did something similar when I was looking to go to grad school. How long do you think it would take a person who has done relatively well in their engineering program to get prepped if they were to work 30 minutes a day, an hour a day on GRE prep?
Yeah, I think it does depend on the person, but I will say compared to things like the MCAT, it's definitely not nearly as intensive as of a prep because a lot of the questions will feel familiar from coursework and even from late high school, some of the math section, I would say. I think for me, I started studying, like I said, about a month and a half out. I think, that worked out all right for me. I maybe would have wanted to start studying a little bit earlier, but I think being consistent over a concentrated length of time worked well for me. So sort of making sure that I was being consistently studying almost every day, but not for very long, for about a month, worked well for me.
Makes sense. Yeah, and that's something that I've seen for other people as well, as that consistency and concentration really helps. You don't have to stretch it out over a year, for instance, to get prepped. So that's good.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've gone through your first year and you're in your second year now in your PhD program. Can you talk a little bit about after you finished your GRE and got your application submitted, what that admission process was like for University of Minnesota?
Yeah, so I think my impression is most graduate schools do rolling admissions. So I heard back from University of Minnesota in December and signed up for a visit weekend. Pretty soon after that, they offered a couple of different visit weekends. Unfortunately, I did sign up for one in mid-March 2020, so I did not end up visiting Minnesota in person. But they held a virtual visit weekend that was very helpful, where some of the professors introduced their research and they talked about some of the facilities and characterization techniques that were available at the university. Kind of tried to give us a general impression as best they could over Zoom. Yeah, I talked to a professor at Minnesota. He reached out to me and kind of tried to give me an impression of the school, give me an impression of his own research. So I spoke to him on the phone before starting at the university. And just sort of started trying to get an impression from the website about which professors I wanted to talk to once I got there, which groups seemed like they were doing research that fit my interest well. And yeah, I basically just made my decision in April, kind of ended up deciding that Minnesota seemed like a good fit for me.
You've also mentioned elements of the pandemic and that interaction that you had with your advisor. And I know you're in your second year and you've already chosen your advisor. What are some of the tips you could give folks to what's a good way to choose an advisor? What are some of the things that they should be thinking about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, I chose my advisor. I liked the people in the group that I'd met, the other grad students. I think that is important. But I also really liked talking to him. I thought he had really interesting opinions on science. I liked the way he talked about science. I read some past papers from his group and sort of liked the way he addressed questions. And I also felt in talking to him that I could ask him questions. Like if there's something I was confused about, I wouldn't feel bad, I guess, trying to get clarification from him. I think the way he explains things is very clear. And I think that I really appreciated that about him. And then I also think the research that the group does is really interesting. My project is on perovskite solar cells. So I was pretty interested in sort of learning more about semiconductors and trying to get familiar with that area. So it was based on the project, but also I think talking to him, I felt comfortable talking to him and asking questions, and I felt like the way he ran his group would be a good fit for me.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It sounds like there's elements of the person that you'll be working with, their group, the members that actually are there, and then a large part of it is probably how you perceive the projects that you'll be able to work on the topic area. So that makes sense. And then finally, to close, I think you mentioned you were supposed to visit in March 2020, about when the pandemic was happening, and you went through the sort of the Zoom process. How has that transition been now that you are a full-time student, you're living on campus? Is it still a Zoom environment, or like if you need to do work, can you go into the lab? What's that like?
Yeah, so they have, at this point, Minnesota is fully in person. The classes are all in person. There is a mask mandate, so we're all wearing masks, but classes are in person. And obviously, to go into the lab, I do need to be in person. So I've been going onto campus since last November. to work in the lab a little bit. Again, there's still a mask mandate, so we're all wearing masks. It's gotten a lot more normal, I guess I should say. There's a lot more opportunities to work with other people in my lab, sort of handling the transition from the virtual school, which was what all of my first year, all of my classes my first year were all online. But now that we're starting to transition back in person, it does feel a little bit more normal. I do think Minnesota's handled it pretty well. I mean, I think the virtual visit weekend was really informative, despite them not having a lot of time to get it ready beforehand. I think they were pretty understanding with us in our first year, having all virtual classes. And I think they tried to adjust the advisor selection process a little bit based on the fact that we were all virtual and we weren't meeting advisors in person. So I think they've provided a decent amount of support for kind of a strange, unexpected circumstance. But it is nice now to be much more back in person.
Yeah, and so the expectation is moving forward, there'll be that element of being back in person and less Zoom and all of that, right?
Yeah, definitely. Our group meetings are in person now. Every now and then we'll go virtual because of timing, basically. But it's a lot more in-person meetings with my lab mates, a lot more in-person meetings with my advisor, and then all of my classes are back to being in person. So I think that is the expectation and the hope going forward. I guess we'll have to see, but
yeah. Well, we hope that for you, because that'll be a more normal experience. But anyway, well, thank you, Emma. This has been a wonderful conversation. And if you have any questions for Emma, please email us at phdexpertiseteam@gmail.com, and we'll get those questions over to Emma so she can get you some nice responses. And until next time, stay tuned for our next episode.